Okay, cool. Yes, so thank you everyone for coming and welcome. Green Software Brighton. Tonight, this is a collaboration event with Brighton Cloud, so we'll chat about that in a second. We're sponsored or supported, I can't remember the actual literal term, by these two organisations. So Silicon Brighton, we're going to hear about in a second, and the Green Software Foundation. So if you're kind of interested in this space, that is a really good place to go. Google Green Software Foundation and have a look around. They're building an ecosystem of practices and tooling and open source projects and all sorts around this subject matter of digital sustainability. So have I got a clicker somewhere? Yeah. There we go. Clickety click. Yeah, so we're Green Software Brighton, supported by those two organisations. And also I want to say thank you tonight to Runway East. So if you can see behind here, that's where we are today in this venue. They've also bought the pizza for everybody that is here in the room, and also by Root and Branch, which is my company, and yeah, we do sustainable software development. We get here in this space every month, every third Wednesday usually, and we talk about this subject matter. So today we're talking about cloud, but we talk about development, we talk about product, we talk about behavioral stuff, strategic stuff. So if you're interested in this subject matter, please come here, and we do talks, workshops, panels, roundtable discussions. And our next event, that's why that's on there, to remind me every time. It is the third Wednesday in May, whatever date that is, and that's going to be on the environmental impact of AI. So I'll hand over now to Cameron, I believe, yeah, who's going to talk about Silicon Brighton and this conference in July.
Thank you very much, Adam. Hi everyone, my name's Cameron. I work for Silicon Brighton, and it's true, yes, we do have a conference, but first we are the digital hosts of, digital tech sector hosts of Brighton and Hove. We look after loads of different meetup groups, which is really exciting that we're actually looking after 2 meetup groups this evening, which is really fun. And yeah, so we have a conference Evolve coming up. We're just finalizing our last few details. So if you want to attend, we're not going to stop you. But if you want to exhibit or sponsor, it's kind of now in the next month that you'll need to get in touch with us, as we're kind of putting the last few pieces together on that. It's going to be a fantastic day, and it's also 4th of July in Brighton. So why wouldn't you want to be there? These are some of the other meetup groups that we support. There is definitely something there for yourself. If you've come along to this meetup, I can tell you 100% that there will be another meetup group that you will enjoy if you're not already aware of it. We want to say thank you to all of our supporters as well. Runway East is a huge supporter of ours, allowing us to do events in their spaces. People also, businesses and freelancers also offer up money and support to help with the live streaming as well and everything that we do, so we're hugely thankful for that. And we just want to say a huge thank you to our Silicon Brighton sponsors who continuously fund what we do on a yearly and monthly basis. You can stay up to date on all of Silicon Brighton's activity via this link tree here. Probably the most important link here is our Slack channel, where each meetup group has an individual Slack channel. So if you miss something in the Q&As, or you want to ask something about a job description, or perhaps opportunities locally, there's the place to do it, to stay engaged with our community. So thank you very much. And back to Adam for a little bit, I believe.
That's definitely not the right slide. Okay, so going to introduce James in a second, but before I do, want to chat about Brighton Cloud.
Of course. Is this on? Yeah. Hello, everybody. I'm Zarina Barnsby, and together with Antra, we run Brighton Cloud. So Brighton Cloud is a place where, if you're cloud curious and you're looking for a fantastic community, we work a lot with collaboration events with other areas. So this is our first one, which I'm really excited about, with Green Software Foundation from there. But we run quarterly events. I think Anthra, you had the one in January, which was in regards to natural process language. And we've got other ones in due course. But yeah, we've got a LinkedIn page. If you just look for Brighton Cloud, if you want to know a little bit more about what we do, feel free to reach out. It's a space where it's not about, you know, any certain provider or anything like that. It's everything, and it brings all the different groups and all that stuff together. But yeah, really excited about today's event, and great to meet so many new people who are coming to this event for the first time. What a great one. 2 in 1. Perfect.
Great, yeah. Thank you. So there are a lot of challenges in this space, and one of the biggest ones is cloud and data centers. So the rate at which we're rolling data centers out globally is pretty astonishing. And Greenpixie and James is here to talk about what they do, much better than I can. But they're in this space in a movement called GreenOps, which many of you will know about, and James will talk about a bit more about that today. So yeah, thanks for coming, James, and I'll hand over.
I've actually got this.
Oh, you're sorted, okay.
I'll need the clicker there. Thank you very much. So yeah, the talk is called Exploring Cloud Sustainability. It was nice and vague, mostly because when they were making the design, I hadn't actually decided what I'd call the slides or the agenda. So I've kept it as such, but it's I've got quite a long slot, so we cover quite a lot of topics, but I wanted to touch on that bit of GreenOps as well. And you may think they're the same, but actually there are subtle differences between them, which we'll get to. But what I hope you'll come away from this talk with is, understanding what we mean when we talk about GreenOps, as well as the fact that, the engineers and the software developers who are working in the cloud are the ones who really hold the power to green software, cloud sustainability, and GreenOps, and how you can actually kind of get started with it at your organization and the first steps you might take. It wouldn't be a sustainability talk if there weren't some big, scary numbers. So I wanted to start with one that actually kind of started Greenpixie, which is the fact that Flexera in their most recent report estimate that 27% of cloud is actually wasted usage and wasted spend. 4 years ago when we started, it was actually 35%. So we're heading in the right direction, but this is still pretty crazy. But when it's come to a spend perspective, it's the company's spend. Who cares? They can spend it how they want. But cloud spend does actually, and cloud usage relates heavily to, the amount of electricity and carbon you're using. We predict, well, Goldman Sachs predicts that by 2030, we'll be using 1,000 terawatts per year, with 209 terawatts of that being from AI. So if 27% of that is waste, that is 287 terawatts. But, what is a terawatt? It's kind of hard to picture what that is. But 1 terawatt is enough to power 82,000 homes for an entire year. So when you're thinking about 287, that's 22 million homes powered for a year, which seems pretty crazy, but still it's hard to imagine. But when you start seeing, articles like this, we don't have enough electricity to create new homes, you start thinking, could we be more efficient in our data centers so we don't need more of them, we don't need more capacity, so we can actually build those 22 million homes for people who need them. You see, electricity and water are closely related to data centers, and we're building data centers in areas where they're water scarce, mostly because data centers require a lot of land, and the land is cheap in the middle of the desert. So that is where they'll build them, and they take that water from somewhere. And you see more and more articles about how AI is increasing the cloud provider's total carbon footprint exponentially, and you also see their reports around how their net zero is still on track, net carbon by 2030, despite Microsoft's emissions soaring by 30%. So how does it all fit together? And if any of you are developing in multi-cloud, you've essentially got, for every different vendor, they've got different numbers, different calculations behind that CO2 number, different ways of measuring kilowatt hours, different ways of delivering to you that data. And it might all say CO2, but when it comes to cloud and even sustainability in general, not all CO2 is made equal. I like to use the currency analogy, and this may be obvious to a lot of you. 1 does not equal 149, but if you actually added a currency to it and you understood where the numbers come from, $1 is exactly equal to 149 yen. So when you think of the carbon numbers that AWS are giving you, it might be 1 ton. The Azure numbers might be 100 tons. They're actually talking about the same number just because they've calculated them all so differently. So when it comes to cloud sustainability, having that context and that understanding of where the numbers are coming from and how you can actually apply them is the key bit. And then this kind of brings me on to what GreenOps is. GreenOps is about thinking about cloud sustainability, but applying it to the business context. If I was to create a table of comparison, cloud sustainability is driving down emissions, reporting, typically high level and qualitative, and it's driven a lot by the cloud providers and how they optimize their own data centers with new ways to new cooling systems or more renewable energy certificates. But for me, GreenOps is actually a kind of practice you have internally that embeds sustainability decisions into every part of the cycle, from products to strategic infrastructure choices. It's about the data and ROI driven. So how can you use sustainability as a mechanism to drive more business value? There's a difference between GreenOps and cloud sustainability. And it's as I'll kind of touch on later, it's a bottom-up grassroots approach, because the people making decisions in the cloud day to day are the software engineers who are actually building. So GreenOps is actually less of like a framework or a set of instructions, but it's actually a way of thinking about what you're doing. We're not trying to retrain you from software engineer to GreenOps engineer, but actually just instill different ways, a different mindset into FinOps people, into sustainability people, into engineers, so that as they're going through their day-to-day and putting their skills to good use, they're thinking about what is the GreenOps story throughout all of this. And I keep mentioning it's about bringing it back to business value. And, you got to balance cost incentives and performance incentives and layer on the environmental incentives. And if you err too much towards environmental, you're going to start losing champions and losing the story. So GreenOps is about finding that sweet spot where everybody wins and everybody gets business value while still driving sustainability. Now, I come from a FinOpsy background. I'm not an engineer myself. I work on the infrastructure, not the code, but the two are closely aligned. But I like to use FinOps as a example, because it's one of the key personas in the GreenOps sphere. Even though anyone can be a GreenOps philosopher, FinOps is pretty close, because they look at the infrastructure level and how to optimize from a cost perspective. And these are some pretty typical things a FinOps guy might identify. Whether they can action them or not, who knows? But FinOps guys tend to not be technical, and they actually rely on engineers. But if you were to add a GreenOps lens to these FinOps things, you'd start seeing there's quite a lot of overlap between what saves costs and what saves money. So how can the GreenOps philosopher tell the story to really drive more action in these? Because if you ever read the FinOps annual report, it talks about how one of the top 10 problems they have is getting engineers to take action on those cost problems. But potentially, if you start layering in the GreenOps story with good data, could you actually drive these, this backlog of right sizings or workloads to auto scale, or actually get that the storage tiering initiative off the ground, and even start touching on things that won't affect your costs, like different chipsets, although we'll touch on an interesting chipset use case later. But switching to low carbon regions, like that's actually probably pretty tough for a lot of people to do. But can you use the carbon as the business case to do that? At least present the data to them to make them ask the right questions. When you're applying it to something like right sizing, which is typically one of the low hanging fruits, you've got your typical cost savings, which is the things you're presented with every day. But you start layering on the projected carbon and water savings. You're kind of changing the narrative from you're not saving the company's money, you're saving your own planet. But what I find most interesting about the data is, what is the most cost saving is not necessarily the most carbon saving. And it creates an interesting opportunity for the company to change the priority. Like, which one would the CFO want you to do first, and which one would an engineer actually want to do first? How do you balance the two and change the order about what your company is prioritizing? And a common one is maybe some people here are having to deal with it right now, like moving from Intel to Graviton or to AMD because you've been told it's much more energy efficient. And It is true. Both of them are quite energy efficient. But, when you think of it from the business context, you might look at this and think, if you were just looking at the cost, you might think Graviton is a no-brainer. But actually, in some use cases, AMD is marginally more kilowatt hours. But going a step further than just costing carbon, how much effort is it to recompile everything into ARM rather than x86? Is it just much easier for, the same cost savings and even more kilowatt hour savings to just move to AMD? But, a similar thing for serverless. If you're left with options around, do I auto scale to off-peak hours and save some cash, but it's quite quick? Or do I put the effort in? Do I use carbon to make the business case to drive more value from cost carbon? But, when you're telling someone to spend 3 weeks doing something, you need a really compelling business case. Cost isn't always enough to every single stakeholder that needs to give the thumbs up. So how can carbon change that story for you? There's always other business factors at play. Re-architecting something, may require downtime. It comes with risks. Moving things to ARM requires a lot of time and a lot of cost investment. And not every vendor supports ARM either. So there's a lot of risk involved there. Ultimately, these are examples actually of how this is the typical priority list, but GreenOps is about adding that extra column where you're holding sustainability in high regard as you would performance and cost. And you're not necessarily prioritizing it over all the other things. I think that's where cloud sustainability might be. But how can you create that balance, that equilibrium where the CFO is driving that business value, you're doing good for the environment, your apps are still performing well. This is the equilibrium that GreenOps is trying to get. But GreenOps needs engineers, even more than FinOps teams do. Because when you think about how FinOps works, there's quite a lot of low-hanging fruit typically that you can start doing in the procurement phase. There's things like savings plans, commitments, reservations. These don't really involve engineering engagement yet. You can just do these without engaging the engineers at all. The engineers start becoming more important later down the line. But with GreenOps, you see that because it's not about different ways to procure, it's driven solely by usage and locations and how you're layering your architecture. You really need the engineers brought in from the get-go, basically, because they're the ones who action the change. And when you're a company like MasterCard, who's got 10,000 engineers, one GreenOps person can't be constantly optimizing every single decision that's done. You need to shift that left towards the engineers, give them the visibility so that they can make the decisions for themselves when they're making the decisions, not afterwards. I wanted to go into actually, I guess, the practical steps for where you can get started. So step one is definitely not to go storming into your boss's office and start saying we need to prioritize cloud sustainability over cost and performance, because it is more of a political game than that, where you need to be able to speak to the different stakeholders, understand their pains, and find the business case within every single person. So I'd say step one is actually shift your own mindset to start treating carbon more as a currency. Start asking the questions from the start. Whenever you're in every discussion that you're having going forward, bring up, is there a sustainability use case here? Can we start looking at electricity just as another performance metric in the dashboard and seeing whether it's going up and down depending on what you're doing? And start seeing big spikes of energy and carbon or as problems to be solved, not as things to be hidden away. It's certainly not, as I keep saying, it's not a thing for one person to do. It's not a centralized function. You will find allies in sustainability teams, in engineering and software teams, in procurement teams, finance, and most importantly, leadership. Ultimately, you need the executive buy-in to be able to drive this forward. A common question might be like, we have revenue targets. Why would we bother about GreenOps? And this is where a GreenOps philosopher would say, what is the strategies we're using to get to those revenue targets? Are we doing a big engineering hiring push so we can build more applications and drive more revenue? How are we going to make sure we get the best candidates for those engineering roles? How are we going to make sure we get the most submissions? Is showing that you care about sustainability at an engineering level going to drive that? We actually see quite a lot. Like, we actually did a job post a couple of weeks ago for a GreenOps specialist, and we're just a 20-man startup, and we got over 1,000 applicants because we're really prioritized sustainability in our company. We've got sustainability in our blood, and if you're telling people that their bonuses or their wages and their pay rises are based on how well they're hitting sustainability KPIs, so they can go home and say, I didn't save the company $10,000, but they go home and say, I've saved the equivalent of 20 trees today. That could be something that they actually want to tell their children. And it's not about telling people what to do, but influencing them slowly and with little nudges over time. So just in your architecture reviews or your stand-ups, think about if someone's trying to use GPT Pro over GPT Mini. Start asking, do we need the biggest LLM there is to build this new chatbot we're doing? What are the options? What would be the carbon impact of that? AI has actually brought quite a lot of interesting opportunities for cost optimization and carbon optimization, because if you're an engineer wanting to build a good application that gives good answers, your first reaction would be to go for GPT Pro. But not only is it 15 times more expensive than GPT Mini, but it's also 10 times more energy consumptive. So, how do you fix that? And one thing we're seeing people doing now is something called query routing, where you actually let the end user ask a question, and then before you've even invoked a token, you ask them, do you want an extremely detailed answer, or do you want an okay answer? And then route them towards the different LLM. And we're still waiting to see what the results of that are. I'm guilty of using LLMs. I probably don't need to. I like making Ghibli images of things. So, now I'm meant to know what the impact is. So I don't know, people who don't even know what GreenOps is, how they use AI is probably quite different. But can you surface the fact that, depending on their choice of GPT Pro, GPT Mini, the carbon will be 10x? Does that change behavior? Because ultimately, you want to use the data in front of the right people to influence behavior. But the actual choice at the end of the day will be with the business or the user. But all a GreenOps philosopher needs to do is just be there telling that story. It is about incepting the idea of GreenOps. There's no right answer. You won't have all the use cases in your company. But if you start leading by example, asking the right questions, and inspiring people to ask questions on their end, it kind of becomes a bit like I was going to make a COVID analogy there, but maybe that's not the right one. But if you can get the GreenOps idea to spread by asking the right questions. But it does actually start with finding data that fits your needs. If you're trying to make choices between AMD and Graviton, but you've not got data that has that level of nuance, then the GreenOps story kind of falls apart. So it's very much a data-driven exercise. Or if you're trying to convince people to move storage tiers, but you don't distinguish every gigabyte month is the same as far as your data says, then again, the story won't quite work. But And finding the right data is the hardest bit, because I find a lot of people make the mistake of going directly to the cloud provider console, for example, and finding the closest CO2 number they can find. But being able to scrutinize the data and ask the right questions: is this market-based? Is it location-based? How timely is it? Because engineers need to make decisions every day, so a 3-month delayed dashboard is essentially useless to them. So really looking at your usage, I think the Green Software Foundation recommends you use usage as a proxy. But you can go further than that and find methodologies online. That's the one thing Greenpixie does, is we help you get that data, and we put that in the hands of people like yourselves, so you can choose between different instance types, different storage tiers, time shifting, and we try and enable as many of the different techniques as there are. And one thing, I've actually kind of whizzed through these slides, to be honest, but hopefully that's fine. But one thing I did want to finish on is that it is going to be a work in progress in your company. Trying to build the business case and immediately push through the contract or the purchase order is gonna be tough. So you need to slowly build interest in it with a constant, like a wave crashing into a rock that slowly edges its way down, and always listening to people's use cases and switching on that lens where you ever hear someone talking about a migration to cloud and you think that kind of sounds like sustainability. Is there a story there? Does our current data support it? Is the data that's supporting it rigorous? Is it useful? Does it have the nuance we require? If it doesn't, where could I source different data? Yeah. I'll open it up to any questions that there may be.
You got a question there?
Yeah. Thanks, James. One of the things that I've struggled with at work is when you try and talk about sustainability with people, they don't always have the knowledge or the terminology. So when you're trying to sort of like raise an issue like how much carbon is used, you end up talking about quite specific things, but I find that most people don't have that. So maybe in your experience or with any of the clients that you've worked with, how best do people sort of manage that upskilling?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I find the best way is it really is per persona or stakeholder. The leadership, they speak in terms of overall trends, KPIs, and things like that. So how can you engage them around how this might drive revenue, rather than jumping straight to the carbon story around how much we're emitting? It could be like, there's an opportunity here for the carbon story that we've already done something, we've already migrated, or is there an engineering hiring push that we could use this as something for? And then there are trainings out there to kind of upskill people on things like what are scopes 1, 2, and 3. But ultimately, I think it's up to a GreenOps philosopher to be able to speak the lingo on their side. I mean, FinOps has the same problem. You're trying to talk to engineers about like what is a reservation, for instances, or
it gets technical quite fast, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So it's a challenge across the board, but yeah, we do find, it's an interesting question. It's tough.
Cool, thanks.
Do you not see this as something that should be just wrapped into a carbon tax of some description? Because seeing a triangle as a square is quite upsetting because it makes your triangle untriangular. But you can remove the green component. You use quite a nice word for it, I can't remember. But make it back into a triangle by wrapping it into cost.
Oh yeah,
so nice triangle.
Yeah.
Square.
Well, you'd need to drag it across somehow, which would kind of mess it up. But I think cost and carbon are fundamentally not the same.
But by taxing carbon,
arguably, Well,
fixes your table you had earlier with the disparate costing between carbon and performance.
But you'd still need to be able to measure that carbon properly. And also, you know, one thing I touched on earlier is that, you know, when you look at carbon, there's a million ways to calculate carbon. So unless you're like, I think energy and water are the more critical resources we need to look at. And it's not just about using money to offset that. Like there's real life impact to the use of electricity and water that you can't quite tax away. But I think, you know, trying to compare or, you know, tax carbon, then you're falling into the trap of, you know, can I just throw money at the problem, which is currently like what the cloud providers do to make these claims, is AWS and Amazon buy the most renewable energy certificates in the entire planet. But I think there's quite a lot of information out there that would say renewable energy certificates do not actually drive meaningful change in the amount of renewables in the source. So treating carbon, energy, and water as a currency doesn't quite work in my eyes, because, you know, fundamentally you can spend a good dollar if you get $10 back, but there's no good gram of carbon emitted unless you're some kind of super niche, you know, carbon sequestering company, but not many people are that. So every gram of CO2 that's emitted is bad, which is, yeah, a fundamental difference to how people treat cost. So if you start trying to treat them the same, then it's like, oh, that CO2 is fine because I made $10 off the back of it. But that is the opposite of what we're trying to do.
Great answer.
I'm interested in the term GreenOps and how widespread it is. Could you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, there's a few different definitions of it going around, to be honest. If you went on Wikipedia, you'd see it's some kind of prehistoric trilobite insect thing. But I consider it, you know, is it green DevOps? Is it green operations? I think the jury's still out. But for me, however people define it, it's just that I think it's a word that makes you think slightly differently. The word GreenOps is picking up steam. You know, when we started 4 years ago, it didn't particularly exist. But now I think GreenOps is a word that means the entirety of IT sustainability at the moment. I use it on cloud because I'm biased and I like the cloud. But yeah, in terms of it picking up speed, you know, I think because it was so undefined for so long, there wasn't many people using it. But I think it is now becoming a bit more commonplace as the word to be used.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to look it up some more. I think like a follow-up comment to that is just coming from more of a UX space. I suppose my fear is like we had sort of re-ops emerge as research ops. And it kind of, I feel like it's led to a level of atomization of people who are essentially like working for the same thing, but using different terms for that same way of thinking and filtered thinking. So it's like, how can you make sure that like regenerative and sustainability and digital sustainability are also part of that kind of taxonomy, I guess, of similar thinking spaces, so that collaboration still happens?
Yeah. I mean, arguably green software is a pillar of GreenOps because they're all interconnected. I imagine a big Venn diagram of how everyone's using it. And I think, you know, it's probably just waiting for some kind of centralized body to bring together the different pillars of GreenOps, from devices to hardware to, you know, your on-premise data centers and cloud. So yeah, I think I see that's where GreenOps is going, but I think it's still a bit of an arms race as to who you just define it however you want in the moment.
Thank you.
Hi there. I wasn't sure who your intended target, like first target for GreenOps was, because you said it should be philosophy spread around, but I can't really imagine what the program code, how they will think about GreenOps versus the architect who's thinking about frameworks. So what's your main target for adopting GreenOps philosophy?
Yeah, well, we're having a lot of success in going through the FinOps and the cost optimization lens at the moment. Let me just go to the overlap slide, because a lot of the key practices that they're doing is, you know, driving a lot of kilowatt hours and CO2 reductions as well as cost. And ultimately, they're kind of there to drive business value as well as identify ways to make sure people are getting the most bang for their buck. But, you know, I mentioned in the talk that one of their key problems is getting the engineers to care about that. So in terms of, you know, where GreenOps becomes useful and who it's most powerful in the hands of, you know, these guys are already doing the reporting on cost accountability and show back and charge back and who owns this piece of usage across the company. So they're in a good position to add sustainability to. Yeah.
What are you calling an engineer in that instance?
Good question. Yeah, you'll have to ask the people who did the FinOps annual survey around how they defined engineer. But they've got a list of the top 10 problems that FinOps is facing. But it's a good question around, you know, how they did that survey and who ticked the box for engineers. I guess how do FinOps people define engineer is an interesting question.
I mean, I agree with pretty much everything here, but would you say it's all just creative accounting at the end of the day? So like using low carbon regions, for example, how does it mean you just go out and buy cheaper carbon quotes? Or does it mean you move your service to a cheaper region? So it's all about the cost in the end, because the carbon emissions are pretty much the same if you put your Amazon server in one place or another place.
Yeah, well, that's where you've drunk the Amazon Kool-Aid.
So that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, because, you know, they may buy loads of, you know, or they may subsidize wind farms in Sweden, but those green electrons are not going to their Texas data centers. And, you know, they don't publish their on-site renewables, but that's the key difference between what we call market-based and location-based accounting, where, you know, if globally you're producing 100 megawatts and then you're buying 100 megawatts from multiple places around the world, that is different to your data center in Texas is running on an electricity grid that is 40% fossil fuels. So when we're looking at the GreenOps philosophy and how you drive action, you know, again, having that, you know, move this region to go from 0 carbon to 0 carbon, that is not data that would drive action. That is not actionable or useful to anyone, in my opinion, apart from maybe an ESG report to make you look good. But, you know, the data that we use is the location-based data. So, you know, you can move to France because they use a lot of nuclear. You can tell the difference between Wales and London because Wales has a lot more fossil fuels in their region. So that's the difference between like Azure, UK South, and UK West, UK East, UK Central, one of those. Yeah. So that's an important question, to be honest, is like finding the right data that tells that story. Because if you were to believe Amazon, you would think it's 0 all around. But then that's the carbon piece, but every single data center has different power usage effectiveness depending on the temperatures and their cooling systems and water usage effectiveness. And these regions have different water scarcity. So if you cared about the local people around that area, maybe you wouldn't put all your GPUs inside the Texas data center where water is particularly scarce. So it's about thinking beyond just carbon and being able to ask the questions of the data is like, why would I care about locations if they're both 0? Is a great question, and it prompts the answer. We need to look at better data that actually takes into account local grids. Well, I think you'd be able to follow up.
I mean, I'm just the way I see it, unless it's saving company money, no one really cares about carbon footprint or any of that stuff. Well, I mean, I worked for a few companies in my life, and I mean, back in the day, you do optimize your algorithms, etc., because you have so little memory, so little disk space. You know, you have to be optimal as much as possible. As these days, you just throw resources at it, and that's it. So
Yeah.
there's very little incentive to do anything optimized way to save any money, because if the developer does something, they optimizes code, it doesn't benefit him as a person. Maybe it benefits a company because they're saving money on the Azure cloud, whatever. But to trickle down all the way from profits into someone's salary, that's a big problem in my mind.
Yeah. Well, again, that's why it's like you would not start with these. Getting your CFO to buy in on spending money on these is going to be a super tough challenge. And that is not what we recommend. It's about finding those double wins. And depending on like your perspective, like this is the perspective of the FinOps guy who's trying to get people to do this. But if you're trying to drive, I guess an initiative where you start treating energy as a KPI for some reason, or you're an engineering manager and you need to convince people to move to ARM for whatever reason, the company is suggesting it because there's a huge cost saving. But how can you double that up with the carbon savings just to change the story depending on the stakeholder you're trying to talk to? And it's all about driving that double value, the win-win, that's where GreenOps tries and hits that target. Where's that other picture? Let's see, there's this, that sweet spot of all the incentives that's why GreenOps isn't easy, because this takes a while to find across all the different business units and business cases.
This again,
I did, but it was kind of, I'll ask it anyway. Maybe it was already answered. Thank you.
It was actually that last slide you were just on, the Graviton versus AMD. That was quite interesting for me because, if you do just listen to AWS or whoever it is, this is the best thing to do. It's the most environmentally best. I'm interested to know how you kind of did the research to understand that actually it's potentially not, because I think that'd be quite useful. And then myself being able to question these things in the future.
Yeah. Well, if you were to just go off Amazon's claims, as you said, like they'll tell you it is 60% or 70% more energy efficient than a similar instance types, and it's up to 70%, which basically means it's not 70% more efficient. But there's no denying that ARM is better than x86 in a lot of ways. But we've actually done some proprietary research on ARM and Graviton to help create those consumption curves. And then we work closely with AMD as well, because, again, they've seen in their benchmarks that they are actually better than Graviton in quite a few ways. But, it's hard to beat Amazon's marketing. So how do we find the truth? And I guess that's another lens of GreenOps that we didn't really touch on here, is getting down to the base truth, asking questions until you have data that is rigorous enough and that you feel is trusted enough to be able to make decisions. Because if you don't trust the data, you're not going to use it to make a different decision. And then if the data can't be used to make a decision, then it's useless data, in my opinion.
This kind of drives GreenOps into a whole finance world of how much money you've got in the bank, like how much carbon you're using, isn't a simple question, because looking at that slide there, so I need to recompile my code, and if my developers keep messing it up and it doesn't compile, and you have to, you've got loads more CI/CD runs there,
Exactly.
So that's burning carbon every time you run it. What's the carbon cost of building the chassis with the CPUs in compared to the two things? And the carbon, I can move my workload from this data center that's been there for 20 years and has got really slow spinning disks that use loads of power to this new one. But so I think there's, again, it's not just one number, is it? It's
no.
Capital investment.
It's a big
return on capital.
It's a big web of trade-off decisions. And ultimately, from my perspective, GreenOps is about making sure the data is there so climate impact can be seriously taken into consideration in the web of trade-offs you're already thinking about. And I think it's also, particularly if you're getting started, it's not about finding new initiatives to do with this new GreenOps data. It's about finding initiatives that are already in progress and finding the carbon story in there and being, okay, these ones are cost saving and there's a carbon story. These three are just cost saving. Maybe it'll make carbon worse. How do I accelerate the 5 that have the win-win and use the carbon story and data that we trust to drive that decision?
That's maybe an important point, making sure the things you're doing aren't carbon negative. Yeah, they're always carbon positive.
Yeah, and if you are going all in on AI, there's probably no way that'll be carbon positive. Well, it'll be bad for the environment. But how can you give them data so at least when they go into it, it's an informed ignore, essentially. Like they know building this LLM is going to be 1,000 tons, but they want to do it anyway. At that point, you know, GreenOps needs to accept that the business has made this choice, but at least it's been a more informed choice rather than trying to change how the company thinks in its strategy. Just about, you know, building in that consideration into the web of trade-offs with data. I feel like you had another question.
So you had a nice touch on the turn up home saying, I saved some trees today. That's a nice touch. I mean, that's
nice.
part of what attracted me to my current job. So,
Anybody else with any more questions? No?
Not really a question, but just something for myself. Sorry, I'm at the back of the room. So it's Arena from Brighton Cloud. One of the things that I'm aware of, and I just wanted to find out from the audience, so question to you, is who here has heard of the Green Software for Practitioner certification? Yay, good. Who here has done it? I've got a prize for you, which I'll give you out later on. It's just a little Brighton Cloud keychain, so well done on that. But otherwise, for those of you who haven't heard about it, I just want to let you know a little bit about it. So it's free, it's globally recognized, and it's been designed and built from the Green Software Foundation in partnership with Linux Foundation. It goes through 6 different core categories, some of them being cloud, some of them being carbon awareness, efficiency for carbon and energy as well. And it's essentially for everyone, anyone who's involved with designing, building and maintaining software and hardware. So if you haven't had a look at it at all, have a look online. It's a really great thing. You get a certification at the end. So I think it takes 2 to 3 hours. And then you've got 20 questions to ask, and then you get that accreditation as well. But it's a really good resource. Take a look at that one as well.
Awesome.
It's the Green Software for Practitioners. I'll put a link out on the Brighton Cloud stuff, and we'll send something out together.
Yeah.
But it's with the Linux Foundation.
Yeah, if you go to the Green Software Foundation and page and then click around a little bit, you will find it. It's pretty up front and center.
I get all my architects to do that as well.
Yeah.
It's just that awareness and appreciation. And we were talking a lot about bringing people along and creating that awareness, even for lots of different people, from product managers, testers, to lots of different roles. It's something really good to look at.
Yeah.
We're actually building a GreenOps training as well. So if you're interested in that, to learn more about cloud sustainability fundamentals and then more about GreenOps philosophy, come find me. I'll add you to the backlog.
Yeah, definitely send us the details. That'd be great.
Yeah, you can send it out afterwards. That'd be great.
Yeah, we'll send out communication. Excellent. I want to make one comment based on what you were talking about there. I think actually you kind of surfaced the core problem, which is that the mechanics with which we all operate is based on cost, but ultimately it's delivered by the planet, natural resources, and actually carbon is like an output of that process. So we can either choose to continue going that way, or we can change how we do things. That's the simple choice that organizations and the individuals have. So yeah, I think that was that's kind of the core thing to hold up. Any other questions before we kind of finish? Oh, there's one. Yeah, cool.
James, you mentioned the difference, how different organizations measure carbon in terms of tons and things. What are we going to do to fix that? So you got any solutions of how we can pressure those organizations to come across a common standard?
Yeah, it's unfortunately it's mostly driven by regulations and things like that, and they typically look for the lowest common denominator, especially considering, you know, how these are global companies who are typically, well, now most of the big cloud providers are situated in the US, so I don't think we can expect much regulation from them for a little bit. So I think, yeah, it's a tough question. You know, until it costs more for them to not do it than it does to do it, I think there won't be much of a shift. But that's why, you know, you've got third-party sources. Third-party sources. Yeah. There'd be incentive for them to source it out, but not necessarily incentive for an engineer to do differently.
I mean, like all the stuff you mentioned within the middle of people, like it's a case of you just need more time to do that. If they do like more time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. How do you do something to shift those priorities? You know, it's got to come from the top down. Basically, if the company, if the leadership will tell you fast apps that are performant and, you know, hit those deadlines that are always the top KPIs, then, you know, GreenOps is going to struggle. So that's why it needs to be an organizational shift, definitely. And how you convince leadership is by trying to demonstrate that it should drive cost savings. Is one of the key things, because that's the language they speak.
The thing I find a little bit baffling is, like, if we thought about the UK as a company, we do have a strategic plan because we're part of the Paris Agreement. So if you mapped that down to organizational level, in a way, you could have goals, but it doesn't happen that way. It just becomes abstract, and it's a shame.
Yeah. Well, many companies have net zero goals, but are they actually heading towards them in the right way? Are they just prioritizing things like, you know, the office space and doing those low-hanging fruits where you can, you know, just purchase power differently for your office, even though it probably doesn't get the green electrons, but their IT is only going in one direction, so they'll have to get to it at some point if they want to hit these net zero goals. It could be sooner or later.
Okie doke. I think not sure actually what the time is, but we're probably close. Okay. We are going to walk down there to Unbarred, and have a beer and chat a little bit more. And so anybody here in the room that wants to join us, do. Yeah, and thank you, James, for coming and chatting about that stuff. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.